And I'm really looking forward to you seeing today's movie. And it actually took quite a while to bring to you, just in terms of the technical stuff. I did have a very low-res version of the movie, this one here, but the quality was just too poor. Um, you can see the black and white, the quality is not good at all. It's a really fascinating look into one part of JFK's presidency. And it's a really interesting look into part of our history as a country. Um, so I took some time to bring you a much higher quality version, which is right here, and you can see that the quality is really great. It's shot on film, really beautiful, 16 millimeter black and white film. I love the graininess. And it's interesting, when digital became really big, digital film cameras, a lot of them couldn't capture the grain, that film grain look that is really so unique to film. And I don't want to really play it on this because sometimes I'm not able to upload the lecture if it has too much of a copywritten movie in it. But just notice that grain. That's the photochemical process of developing film. And these days, digital cameras are so good that they look as good, if not better, than film. But film itself has such a unique look. So this movie is called Crisis Behind a Presidential Commitment, and it aired on television in 1963. I think it's a really fascinating look into part of our history, the early civil rights movement in the 1960s. George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, pro-segregationist, a really staunch racist, and he's famous for his speech where he said something like, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And he talks about his point of view in this documentary. And he was governor of a state, and this movie that we're going to watch is about when he stood in the doorway of a college to prevent black students from enrolling. And JFK, the president, and Robert F. Kennedy, the attorney general, his brother, and of course, hindsight, we know what happens. JFK would go on to get assassinated just a few months after this aired, and RFK would get assassinated later in the 1960s. And I had read somewhere that George Wallace, this staunch racist and forever kind of a villain in history, I'd read somewhere, I forget which of the books it was in, but when he was on his deathbed, his son or grandson commented that he regretted his actions. He had deep regret for all of it. I don't know, maybe he saw that he was just on the wrong side of history at that point. So really, really interesting, and just these dark parts of our history as a country. But the more people know this, I think the more we can move into the right side of things. So See It Now was very, very impactful, and you caught a glimpse of the journalism style sort of meshed with documentary filmmaking style, and it was a really big TV show. It was a major influence on TV journalism, spawning many successors, most notably the documentary series CBS Reports and 60 Minutes. So those kinds of shows really come from this See It Now, and it all goes back to Edward R. Murrow, this giant in television and journalism. So now let's talk about Robert Drew, the filmmaker of Crisis. And so many documentary filmmakers of this period, and even today, I think, stem from the Robert Drew school of documentary filmmaking. And I talked about how many times throughout history we're seeing groups of peers working together, and even a lot of his proteges are still around today, still making documentaries, still teaching at film schools and whatnot. But Robert Drew, an American documentary filmmaker known as one of the pioneers, or sometimes called the father of cinema verite or direct cinema. And again, I see these as different, cinema verite versus direct cinema. And I have a slide later about the differences and similarities between the two. And what we're going to look at, I think, is more direct cinema related. So questions Robert Drew pondered. And here we have filmmakers almost like John Grierson thinking, okay, how can we use film? Questions pondered by Robert Drew were, why are documentaries so dull? And that is, sometimes it's a negative connotation of what we think when we think of documentaries, especially historical documentaries. Oh, they're boring, slow, and some of them are. A lot of them are, actually. So, but he wondered, what would it take for them to become gripping and exciting? And I think this film we're going to look at is really gripping and exciting and suspenseful, even though we know the outcome. We know that eventually all the schools desegregated. This movie was in 1963, and the Civil Rights Act was in 1964. So JFK was assassinated November 1963. Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, went on to become president and pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Robert Drew felt that it was necessary to develop documentary films that would use picture logic rather than word logic. That's interesting too. Think of the British free cinema period. They had a similar look where the image speaks. Remember, the emphasis is moving more towards the image and away from this heavy use of narration. Think about the US propaganda films in response to Leni Riefenstahl, all those Why We Fight movies, and even something like Night and Fog, where the narrator is prevalent throughout. There is a little bit of narration in Crisis, but not so much narration. And we're going to soon look at some Frederick Wiseman movies, and I think those are the really best example of direct cinema. And that is absolutely no narration, just the images and the editing. A form of documentary that would drop word logic and find a dramatic logic in which things really happened. So these filmmakers were really interested in capturing what was really happening. And one of Robert Drew's first movies was this film called Primary. And let me just pull it up on IMDb. And this was kind of what put him on the map, I think. And I have shown parts of it in the past. Honestly, I do find it fairly boring, but it's a movie where he's along the presidential race of 1960. Right here, they call it a cinema verite feature that follows presidential hopefuls JFK and Hubert Humphrey during the 1960 Wisconsin primary. So that's the log line. Primary is available. That was the movie that really put him on the map, and there are some really interesting parts to it. But honestly, I find that it gets a little bit boring after a while. But that's what they were into, trying to capture something as it happened and trying to make the camera sort of unnoticeable. And the emergence of new technology allowed that to happen. Smaller cameras, separate sound recordings. So this was all really emerging at this time. And he said it would be a theater without actors, it would be plays without playwrights, it would be reporting without summary and opinion, it would be the ability to look in on people's lives at crucial times from which you could deduce certain things and see a kind of truth that can only be gotten from personal experience. All right, so this was what they were setting out to do. He formed Drew and Associates and recruited like-minded filmmakers such as Richard Leacock, D.A. Pennebaker, Terence McCartney, Phil Gate, and Albert Maysles. And Albert Maysles and his brother, the Maysles brothers, made several famous documentaries. We'll take a look at some of their stuff later on. But this is the sort of core group that emerged from this school of filmmaking. And now, yeah, I'll come back to the slide on direct. Actually, let me go ahead and show you the slide on direct cinema, just to kind of crystallize what it is. When you hear direct cinema, think of, for the filmmaker, it's direct observation of reality. So the observational mode, you're observing something as it's actually happening. For the viewer, direct perception of reality. So they wanted to just find a way to send it right to you, the viewer. The direct cinema filmmaker has a belief in the spontaneous, unscripted, unrehearsed, uncontrolled cinematic recording of important events, issues, and personalities. The goal of direct cinema is to capture a carefully selected aspect as directly as possible, record footage while events are happening rather than to create footage in the studio. So that's key while it's happening. And I'm really looking forward to you seeing a film next week called The Thin Blue Line, which so much of it is done in these stylized studio reenactments, which I think, I mean, which one is better? I just think whichever one tells the better story, whichever one serves the story the best is better. It's hard to say which method of filmmaking anytime is better, whichever one the story calls for. To provide the viewer with a feeling of being there. And that's one of the things that makes this movie, Crisis, so interesting. And let me just pull this up. Because for the first time in history, audiences were given a look at the presidential, the life of the president. And they had camera crews following JFK and his brother RFK for a period of many weeks, almost like a reality show today where camera crews follow one person for a long time and then they edit a reality show together. So this is the first time that viewers, audiences, Americans were given a look inside the White House. There's even a scene in the movie where they're driving up to the White House, and imagine experiencing that as an audience member back at that time. So here's the logline of this movie. Governor George Wallace will not let 2 black students into an Alabama school against the wishes of President Kennedy. Loud shouts come from both sides of the issue as JFK stands by his decisions. So it's a pretty good, well-written logline. And let us know in the discussion, do you find this movie dramatic? Is it engaging? Is it suspenseful? Because it is a documentary, absolutely. And this was entirely their goal, to record events as they're happening and to give you, the viewer, the feeling of being there. So imagine if you were the president and you were faced with this crisis. Here's this governor from a southern state, even though desegregation is the law, according to the Supreme Court 1954 Brown decision. It's the law to allow black students into colleges. So their goal was to record and reveal, not interpret. But again, we've talked about how every time you point the camera, anytime you make an edit, you are manipulating, and filmmakers have embraced that. And their goal here was to really just show the audience what happened. So using lightweight portable equipment, camera mounted on the shoulder rather than handheld, absolutely. This movie Primary that I talked about, all of that is just handheld camera going on the campaign trail with the 2 candidates. Sound recording is direct and synchronous, often with extraneous noises that contribute to the sense of reality. So absolutely, sound recording is there along with the video recording, and the technology, the crystal sync motors, so they developed motors in both the camera as well as the sound recorder that were in sync, so they didn't have to be tethered together, and they could get into these parts of a room and be relatively unnoticed. Editing is continuous, striving for a chronological rather than dramatic presentation. And it's always interesting to look at the editing in these movies. And this look, 1963, of course, they didn't have cell phones, so they're relying on analog phones with cables, and sometimes they're communicating with each other over these loudspeakers. And in the moment where George Wallace actually steps aside and lets them pass, it's not really seen on camera. It's kind of almost anticlimactic in a sense, but they get word that he stepped aside. We don't see it as the viewer, but that's what they're building towards in this movie. Observation over narration, although sometimes limited narration takes place, and there is a little bit of limited narration in this movie. And this approach dominated further development of the documentary form. Absolutely, and I've talked about how I think around this point in history, most of the major developments have now taken place. And from here, we're really going to see an emergence of new voices, new ideas, and of course, technology never stops. So I think that's about it. So there'll be a discussion about this. It's about an hour long. This is a movie that aired on television in 1963. Actually, I think October 28th, 1963, it aired on television. and it's during the 2 day period before and after the University of Alabama's integration crisis. So there were 5 camera crews that followed John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and the Alabama governor George Wallace and a few other figures as they face this crisis where the governor is standing in the doorway. There's a famous Bob Dylan song, The Times They Are a Changin', where there's a line in that song where Bob Dylan sings, "Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall." And that whole song is about, kind of the old generations need to step aside, and we're the youthful generations emerging. And of course, another big angle to the historical context is the emerging Vietnam War. And if JFK had not been assassinated, I really wonder what our involvement in the war would have ended up being. But once he was assassinated, our involvement escalated very dramatically, and the 60s really took off. So hope you enjoy the movie, and we'll see you afterwards in the discussion.